Okay, we might make a start. So welcome to RBMS's second seminar for 2013. My name is Chris Arnott, and I'll come to our panel and the topic in a minute. So first, a couple of sort of housekeeping bits and pieces. So the intention of tonight is to run very much a Q&A carbon copy format, rather than the panelists sort of talking for periods of time each. What we really want to do is get a really highly interactive and sort of audience-driven format, but that obviously relies on you, the audience, driving that format. So ask lots of questions. There's been a few posted up here. The Twitter hashtag has been trending strongly. Make plenty of comments. Feel free to throw footwear when appropriate. Jeff wanted to say some words about actual filming of the event, which we can't actually work out when it's coming.
So apparently we are filming tonight, but we can't actually see a camera in this room. So if you can anyone see a camera, then you would have thought it'd be there, but there's actually nothing that looks there.
I think it just records the screen and the audio.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's like,
Okay.
yeah.
All right, well, that's good. So
More of a podcast.
So it's not particularly quite as you were expecting, but so as opposed to the panel, so you guys are all you're all faceless, which is good. So because there's an audio, I need to make you aware that you are being recorded. And
teaching and training purposes only.
Yes, that's exactly it. So if you'd like a copy of that at the end, what we're going to do is we'll actually have it on our website. And our website is currently undergoing some changes, so in the next few weeks we're going to have a whole new website. So we'll put it up on that. Our current one doesn't currently support it. But if you'd like a copy of this, anyone, particularly those in the regions, would like a copy of this, please email us at info@rums.com.au. We can send that through because it is a trial, so first go at filming through this system. But our intention is to actually start to increase the value of the RMS to those outside Melbourne and obviously even throughout Australia. So we're actually quite keen to get a lot of information out further afield. So, thanks, Chris.
So just further on that recording component, we spoke about whether or not it's Chatham House, one Chatham House and it's distributed. But the panellists are here obviously speaking from their areas of expertise and their organisations that are still on the fly, although it's Uni Melbourne these days, not DSC, but they're not speaking for those organisations. So let me now introduce that panel. We've got from my immediate left, Ian Rutherford, or I should say Associate Professor Ian Rutherford, from the University of Melbourne and the only fluvial geomorphologist on Australia's National Living Treasure List. And the author of Straightening It, An Idiot's Guide to Remediating Australian Streams. Next on the line is Marty Hillmaker, who is a specialist project engineer at mining giant Rio Tinto, a former top 100 tennis player and the only one capable of designing a stream diversion. Ross Hardy, a technical director at award-winning consulting firm Alluvium, river engineer extraordinaire, and former president of RBMS, where his leadership style was said to be a unique blend of Winston Churchill's determination, Steve Jobs' innovation, and the Dalai Lama's personal charm. And lastly, on the end, Ian Campbell, who I was the only panelist I don't know personally, so I'll just introduce him as the river scientist and director of his own specialist firm, Rithro Ecology, which, by the way, is much easier to pronounce if you've got a lisp. So now on to our topic, mining and waterways, a match made in heaven or hell. What we thought we'd do is move through these three topic areas from sort of the macro, if you like, across the life of a mine and beyond. And the first one really is about whether or not they can coexist. Mining's a large economic stimulator for the economy. It's about 8.2% on last count. But a lot of historical past damage that Ian's been doing some research work on. The second area, once we've decided we are going to mine, what are the appropriate planning controls, design standards, things like net gain and so on. And finally, the whole closure and rehab and touching on some of the disasters, and Ian Campbell's got some interesting experience internationally on that space. So as I said, I'll be facilitating it, and to kick off, I think Mark Stacey's got a question in topic area number one. We'll stick to about roughly 20 minutes per area, which should see us wrapping up about 7:15.
Right, thanks, Chris. So my question is, prominent environmentalist Bill McKibben is currently in Australia speaking out on the future impact of coal mining. Now, according to Bill, the fossil fuel industry wants to burn 5 times the carbon that the most conservative governments in the world say is safe. He quotes, "They're not outlaws against the laws of the state, but they're outlaws against the laws of physics if they carry out their business plans the planet tanks." So my question is, as professionals working in river management, often intersecting with the mining industry, how should we face the moral challenge of actively facilitating mining in our work to achieve healthier rivers?
Okay. Mark,
Should you take money from them, Ross?
Well, there's a couple of elements to it. First up, most of the mining in Australia, there's different types of mining, obviously. There's iron ore, there's gold, there's coal. So what, Bill, is it?
Bill.
Yeah, what he was talking about was largely the coal mining element. So I guess you need to, if you like, separate all the other mining out from the coal mining. And the other element that I want to talk about in coal mining, we're not just talking about, it's not all coal mining, what he's talking about is coal mining for thermal coal. There's a big difference between those two. So if you then separate out the coking coal for steel production, and we're left with just the thermal one, I can't help but say, yes, there is a moral dilemma for us all in dealing with that. The way I choose to deal with that is to work within the framework that I've got, to get the best outcome that I can achieve within the framework that I've got. I can't deny that there's a moral dilemma in there, but that's a personal thing that I put aside, and there are other things that we can do as a society to tackle the issues of global warming and do that through the regulatory processes and whatever else exists out there to deal with the global warming issues. But it doesn't help from a river health perspective. I don't think it helps for me to just walk away and let those rivers, decline because I have not done, fulfilled my job, doing the best I can for those rivers. So yes, there's a moral dilemma, but I'll pursue it in 2 different ways. I want to do the best I can for the rivers, and then there'll be other activities to limit our emissions.
Well, one of the things in this area, it's interesting because if you work with the miners, they're often interested in money, of course, and the regulatory framework they work in and the damage that they do is often certainly a big strain on their operations. But the other thing is that they're actually, when you work with them, they're actually often enthusiastic about doing the right thing. And the other thing is there's not that many people in this space. That's the other thing. You've got to ask yourself, it's an opportunity cost question as well. If I don't work with these people, who's going to? And it could be people who are less effective and informed perhaps. And so, because what's actually happened is it's a very scarce market here around, particularly things like river diversions, for example, a very new area that we might talk more about. How many people are there in Australia who actually have the skill set to identify all the issues around that area? And so are you in the camp or are you outside it? And so, at the moment, I think it's you tend to do more good than harm morally being involved.
I think in any environmental issue, you've always got 2 sets of issues, the technical issues and the value judgments. The technical issues we can deal with as scientists and professionals. The value judgments need to be done through political systems. So you have the option of providing your technical assistance wherever you can, whether that's to regulatory agents or agencies or groups that are trying to cope with mining in their communities or mining companies. And then also trying to work with your own value judgments to influence politicians to bring in sensible policies and to make certain that there is appropriate regulatory mechanisms in place.
Well, I guess that leaves me. Your question, I think, falls within that second category of how do we manage, but it's a good opening, intro. And I think, you've mentioned that Bill was talking about coal, but it can easily be, all mining industry. Basically, the question, as Ross said, it's, we work within the legislative framework, how can we as an industry, or you guys in the industry, influence the outcomes? To me, it's pretty clear you've got to get involved with the legislation and influence that, because if the legislation is leading 5 times, or whatever the numbers are, okay, and that's okay, well, we're going to keep doing it. So, and I can tell you, working with Rio, they're very good at sticking to the legislation and the conditions and the Act. And if the Act and the guidelines, everything says you can do this, they will. And it says you have to comply with this and this, they pretty much will. So to me, it's about trying to get better legislation, or perhaps more regulation, self-regulation. But it's not about can we or can't. I mean, it's how do we. We've got to just get better at working with our government agencies and making better decisions.
We've always got a moral dilemma. We're sitting here today in a nice, easy environment, which is the result of something that's been spoiled, destroyed, wars, the whole lot, right through history. We've got a job to minimise the impact. That's what our job is. So we've got to make it coexist. We've got to sometimes make it 60T to bite the bullet and say, how much are you wearing its natural environment? It just doesn't exist. So the moral side can be argued about all the time, but we need mining. If we haven't got mining, we're dead in the water. We need agriculture. It destroys things. So somewhere along the line, we've got to, shall I say, grow up?
Do you think mining as a land use is more or less, has greater or less impact on the environment than other industries in those landscapes? Ross, you had an interesting comment along those lines when we were chatting earlier.
Yeah, when my experience is up in central Queensland, and I go up there and I see landscapes that are completely flogged out with cattle grazing. And some of the best bits of stream, not always the best, but some of the best bits of stream are in some of the good mining operators who have excluded stock from the streams. If we're looking at what are the big impacts on our rivers, we look at the scale and size of our mining operations, and you look at the scale and size of our agricultural operations, and I think you look at, you'd start saying, well, is mining the big problem with our landscape, or is it something else? And I suspect it could be I suspect it's something else. I suspect, stock in our waterways and the impact of stock on our landscape is much greater impact. Agriculture, forestry.
So it's about 2% of the area of Australia is mining, and it's in terms of water use, it uses annually in Australia 28,000 gigalitres of water is used, and about 500 is for mining. Mind you, it's where that water is that matters. It's usually in the arid zone, which is more important. But in terms of volume, it's not that much. And I agree with you completely, Ross. If you gave me a choice between cows and mining, in terms of the impact on streams, it's worth thinking about.
Just thinking of the impact on streams, one of the things is I don't think we have sufficient legislation to encourage companies to think ahead of what they may happen. For example, look at the Wujik-Ruby River. They cut coal mine underneath it, so it fractured the rock and the stream bed went. That should have been foreseen by consultants and by people working in that industry. Look at all the trouble that's now arising from strip mining in Virginia and areas like that, where they were allowed to just go through and knock down mountains, and streams disappeared. In Margaret Palmer's been talking about that. And these are things which are quite evident, but of course the legislation is slower than the impacts of these effects. The classic example there is coal seam gas, where the legislation is way behind the environmental effects that they may have. So I don't think relying upon the legislation alone is a defence. You've got to look ahead and think this is what it's going to do to this place. I think that's my opinion.
Injicaraby is probably, because that mine's been going 85 years, hasn't it? It's a very old mine. And yes,
but now the new shafts are the ones that fracture the bottom. You get the coal out. It's high quality.
Well, it's a long one. But they let it collapse.
So, keeping on the legislation thing, how, in your roles, do you go about influencing legislation to make things better?
Well, I mean, speaking from my experience within the short period I've been in mining, we don't go about influencing it greatly on a day-to-day basis about implementing its production and sticking to the rules basically. And it's very strict. It's like the military in a way. The rules are what they are, and if you don't adhere to those rules, there's a risk that your license gets taken away, and that's game over. So that's not really an option. So it is really about sticking to those rules, and from what I've seen, certainly the bigger miners, they do it very well. Don't know about the little ones, but the bigger miners have a lot of resources, a lot of people, and they can actually monitor, study and report. And so I'm sure there's, when it comes to offsets and that sort of thing, in a strategic sense, I mean, there's a bit going on, but on a day-to-day basis on sites, it's purely about implementation and adhering to guidelines. So, yeah, from my perspective, it's not about influencing. But I think if there were better guidelines, we would have probably better outcomes on site.
I know, for example, a couple of the coal seam gas, and I'll put it out there that I have worked a lot in the coal seam gas side of things, is that they have gone about trying to influence legislation to, one, move it along to what is more economically friendly for them, to report on what they need to report rather than report on everything. And there is potential there, and it was definitely the case in Queensland, and it will become the case in New South Wales, that there is a potential to influence legislation for the right reasons as well as wrong reasons.
If I could just make a comment there, in terms of my experience, we do, as I mentioned, work up in the Basin, Central Queensland, and I've been involved with a number of projects up there through what's called the Australian Coal Association Research Program. Most of that program is funded through a percentage of the export dollars that are won from exporting coal. It goes back into research, and some of that isn't how to build a better coal bucket and dig more out, but some of it goes into research into better environmental practices. And through those programs, we can influence the outcomes, and that research then starts to influence regulation and legislation. And we've seen that in the last 10, 15 years in Central Queensland, where guidelines that we've been producing, or I've been producing to guide stream diversions or monitoring around stream diversions have been picked up by the regulators in the absence of anything else. So there's the opportunity then to update that and renew that. That's one element. And the second element is, internationally, what we see is Australian companies, it doesn't necessarily relate to Australia, but we see Australian companies such as BHP, Rio Tinto, what they do overseas, my experience with them overseas, is that they will adopt Australian practice as their practice when they go into another country, and they'll use the higher of the two standards. Basically, they'll use the Australian standard where their standards don't exist elsewhere. And that's the other way to start influencing legislation, not necessarily in Australia, but in those other places.
I comment on that historically, because it's a useful thing to do is to look back at the past and to see how has legislation worked in the past. So gold mining is a good example. And so if you look at the history of gold mining, in fact, let me summarise what I'm about to say. The history of this game is that we were always late. Yeah. So we tend to set our legislation. We don't know what's happening at the beginning, and it takes long to catch up. But the outcome is we socialise the losses and privatise the gains. So we all pay the price in perpetuity for not doing it right at the beginning. So let's look at the gold mining history. In gold mining in Victoria, they started to, it was all around water and around sludge and around pollution and all of that. It started in the 1850s. They had the first problems with gold mining and sludge in northern Victoria by 1853. They had problems. In 1887, they had lots of inquiries. Actually, there's a fantastic report you can read on it right here. Because 1887, they had a royal commission into it, and they had the sludge inquiry, and they recommended some legislation which said, if you produce the sludge, you're responsible for it. Nothing happened. All that happened, there was a piece of legislation called the Sludge Act, and that said, that if there's sludge, you've got to put up walls to divert the sludge away from things that matter, like hotels and communities. So it was all about, there was not, and this is the key point, there wasn't a single piece of legislation that said the people who generate the sludge are responsible for it until 1906. So 50 years after the problem was recognised. They had the Sludge Abatement Board in the 1906 inquiry, and then 1915 they had the Sludge Abatement Board set up, by which time it was all too late. And we're still, we can take you out to any stream around most of Victoria, most of the streams are affected by gold mining and that historical process to some extent. It's either mercury, well I didn't know about mercury because I thought it was good for you, but sludge and chemical effects and those sorts of things. And now the same, we can find other examples where we're too late with the legislation, and the principle here has got to be the precautionary principle. And I think that applies to, right now, to coal seam gas. Now, it's also fair to say that the evidence from the US, where coal seam gas has been going since the 1940s, is there actually isn't much environmental impact.
Unless you watch gas lines.
Yeah, that's right. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be precautionary, because we're already rushing into Queensland. But they reckon within the next decade there's going to be 30 to 40,000 wells in the Queensland coal seam gas area. And the effects of that, these miners are in and they're out. Is that unfair?
Yeah. No.
Well, so I was going to mention Tasmania as the other classic, and Sam's very familiar with this one before we sort of get stuck into the miners. So in Tasmania, we had the tin mining. I mean, if you look at the largest single input of sediment and sludge into a stream in Australia is the King River in Tasmania, where they were putting 1 million tonnes of copper-rich sediments into the Queen River and then into the King in southwest Tasmania a year. 96 million tonnes of sludge went into that system, and it's dead.
That's nothing.
Yeah, well, not compared to the Fly and other rivers that you've screwed up. But so now in Tasmania, what happened in terms of legislation that we're talking about was that the government exempted them, because it was such an important sector that BHP was running at the Mount Lyell copper mine. They exempted them from environmental legislation, and then they came to sell the mine, and they sold it to an American company, and the company said, what? Unless you exempt us from any liability for this environmental disaster, we're not buying it. And so the Tasmanian government said, okay, it's our problem. And in fact, if you look across the whole history of this, that's what happens. The state takes on the disasters of the mining sector forever. And then we can talk about Mount Morgan and Dee River and any number of examples. And so that's the history, the lessons of history, I reckon.
Good tourist attraction over there in Queensland.
Yeah,
Queensland.
Yeah.
Question of
Right.
I just want to, I'm not an expert by any means, I don't work in the mining area, but I'm wondering, from a lobbyist perspective, someone spoke about not really having an influence in their day-to-day job in terms of influencing legislation. Don't the mining companies have a significant proportion of lobbyists in Canberra influencing legislation, and what role do they play?
I think I mentioned in my day-to-day role, I'm appointed to a job. I'm not out there to try and lose my job, So, but yeah, look, I'm sure I don't know the answer to your question. But yeah, certainly when I'm on site, when it's about production. You're there to dig dirt, and if you're not digging dirt, you might as well not be there. So. You do all the right things while you're there. So that's what I observe, certainly from one of the bigger miners at Rio. They do a great job of monitoring and all that. Not to say that there's not a lot of large gains can be made by lobbyists back in Canberra or wherever. Couldn't comment on what goes on there.
I think it's fair to say the mining lobby had a bit to do with removing the Prime Minister at one stage. Just give it time. Do you want to make?
Yeah, I do. Look, I think there's a number of issues. and I think it's interesting about the great work that's being done. It's really critical that you have good legislation and regulatory framework, but then you've got to have good regulators as well. And I'm concerned about that, having worked in developing countries where they had very, very few qualified people at all in their regulatory agencies who actually understood what was going on. And increasingly that's becoming the case in Australia, where we're finding that our agencies we need generalists, we don't need specialists, and we need many fewer public servants because they don't do anything anyway. So you're finding that you've got fewer people, they don't have the specialist skills necessary to do the jobs that they're being asked to do. They're managers, which is even worse than lawyers. And then you've got another problem in the mining industry. Most of the work is done by consultants, and I'm sure there are some very good consultants somewhere. But there's very little quality control. Hardly ever. I was working for GHD for 4 years, so I feel like having criticising consultants. And I've worked in a mining company at Octedi as well. Octedi never ever had any of their consultants' reports peer reviewed. They were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on many of them, and some of them were just complete bloody nonsense. The data were obvious nonsense. You've got the same with the regulatory agencies. It's very rare for them to send reports that are sending EIAs out to get properly technically reviewed. The World Bank doesn't technically review documents that they're involved in funding EIAs for. Neither does the Asian Development Bank. So there's a real issue, I think, with quality assurance. Yes, they get some very good stuff. Sometimes the Environment Department at a particular mine or in a particular company have very competent people who have the time to do the reviews themselves, but very frequently that's not being done. And so you've got a real mishmash of some very good stuff and some awful nonsense that's coming out. And that makes it very difficult to...
Doesn't help if the lobbyists are, taking the politicians out for lunch, fancy lunches in their suits, and there's a poor environmentalist in there somewhere, sitting between 20 lobbyists from the mining company who can't really take people out for fancy lunches. It's an interesting proportion ratio, I think. It
depends how much the politicians think that the environmentalist has people backing them who are voters, because they're very sensitive to that. And I think it's also worthwhile maintaining links with people in the regulatory agencies, because they're ones that are suggesting to politicians frequently what should be done and how things can be done.
But Ian, are you implying one of the things you said before, that perhaps we should be somehow regulating the consulting industry?
I think it's a very difficult thing to do. There's been some debate in international rivers recently about whether consultants should be regulated. I know that people like the Ecological Society of America, for example, have got a certification scheme, and the Environment Institute of Australia has one. Some of them I think are fairly rigorous, but some of them I think are a bit of a joke, frankly. And I think it's very difficult in the environmental field because it encompasses such a huge breadth of skills, potentially, and how you would come about deregistering someone. And if you're not going to deregister anybody, then what's the point anyway?
But they're not even registered. The only registration process in the consulting industry is where some of their employees will be registered through the Institution of Engineers. Everybody else is just there totally free.
There's an Environment Institute of Australia that also has a registration system.
But that doesn't carry the kind of consequences for your behaviour that registration with the institution.
Exactly, yes.
So maybe, if an engineer in a consulting company designs a structure and it fails and his name's on the bottom of the plan, presumably there's going to be consequences. Can't we do the same thing for other parts of the system?
But what consequences are there if an engineer does something and the bridge goes down? He might be...
You better ask Ross that, he's an engineer.
Queensland has a registration scheme. That's RPEQ, Registered Professional Engineers in Queensland, and you cannot practice as an engineer. You can't sign off drawings. It can't happen unless you are an RPEQ. And
But isn't that true Australia-wide?
no, I don't have to be. No, I'm a chartered professional engineer, but anyone can call themselves an engineer, actually. Well, no, so you do your qualifications, you do the course, and you become a chartered engineer, but that doesn't mean that I'm the only one who can sign off an engineering drawing. There's no real requirement anywhere else in Australia other than Queensland for a registered engineer to sign off some drawings. Certainly for a lot of civil engineering projects.
Got a few topics and questions here, so I'm moving along a bit. Come on here and now.
In the time that you worked as a consultant, how many reports that you worked on did you actually get feedback from a regulatory body?
For a regulatory body?
An EPA or like a licence requirement thing?
None.
Yeah, that's right.
Going back to registration, we've had a few chats. Engineers Australia have come into Jetstar recently to chat to us about it, and it is remarkably difficult for waterway engineers, environmental engineers, anyone in this sort of strategy planning, catchment planning, because you're not designing bridges. It's remarkably difficult to become chartered, and those that have done it have said, "Don't bother, it's not worth it." And coming back to that, it's a sign of being a good professional, being chartered, and becoming a chartered engineer. 11 of the 15 competencies are actually just being a good professional. But I don't know, maybe that's something this room can take up. But we have to use engineering examples. I can't use an EIA as an example of competent writing. It has to be an engineering example. So it's very, very difficult to then regulate the environment and give it weight when we can't really do it. And we're told, like, the guy in the room was like, "Oh, no, not environment."
That's a really good point.
Can I just chip in there? I've got the benefit of a few years of consulting also, and I only recently joined Rio. But 53% of mining occurs in Western Australia, and about 23 in Queensland. They're massive states. But I would say that I guess the majority of skills when it comes to waterway rehabilitation sit within Victoria. Now, I have actually seen quite a few consultant designs come through to me in WA, and to be quite honest, they're rubbish. Okay, and it's embarrassing to think that people would actually put that on paper and sign off on it. But it happens, and our regulators are often young. You've got to remember these agencies are competing with mining industry who pay a lot more. There's quite a lot of turnover. You've got, reasonably inexperienced people in management roles. So for those types of folks to make decisions to review a topic area that they know nothing about, we've got consultants who are pretty well out of their depth in a lot of these states. I mean, there's a lot of room for improvement there, and it's no surprise to me. It's quite disappointing actually, but it's no surprise that we get some less than good result out on the ground.
I guess you've got the expertise to be able to assess that design is poor, that the individuals on the mining side of the equation that don't have that, so designs getting built.
And the regulators.
Yeah.
And to take it one step further, when I've, like you say, assessed something and gone, that just doesn't look right, and it's clearly less than standard in, say, Victoria, if I wanted to change that, it's actually very difficult. And I'm talking about trying to go back and get an approval overturned and redone for a better outcome, and it might take 3 to 6 months. And so you're holding up a project for 3 to 6 months to get a better environmental outcome. It's about $1 million an hour on one site. It just doesn't add up. They're going to say, get on with your job.
We might move along. We've touched on this second topic a little bit in some of that discussion, but there's some more specific areas around offsets and net gains that people raised, and the Twitter feed's going pretty mad on. So Jeff, do you want to lead off?
I'll just channel that to our Twitter feed, and I'll just to start off, I was going to say, I guess this whole bulldozers versus cows debate, I reckon that actually isn't. I think that's done and dusted yet, because to me, the dozer as a geologic agent is much greater than the cow. So I reckon there's some pretty sweeping comments you need to justify there. And I guess that's essentially a lead-in, because if you think about cows are a very dispersed impact. Mining is a very localised impact. But unfortunately with waterways, the continuity and the connectivity of waterways is so important. And so the damage that is done at a point in the river system, I over 1 kilometre can affect 100 kilometres of stream. Very, very easy in terms of ecology, in terms of sediment movement, everything like that. So the question is, I guess, with regard to offsets, I know very little about this, but presumably there are offsets. If you damage 1 kilometre, you must then pay for some waterway health somewhere else, because essentially a lot of the work you're doing there is not going to do a lot. So firstly, I guess, how are those offsets calculated? You know, if you damage 1 kilometre, you're paying for 1 kilometre elsewhere. And are the ratios of what you damage compared to what you pay for adequate? You'd like to kick that off?
Yeah, so what you're saying is mining has a very small footprint, but it has a great potential to affect long systems. Now I think it's a really useful hypothesis to compare cows with mining, and I think that's something we should pursue. I think you get away with a lot more, cows get away with a lot more than mines do, you know, in a regulatory sense. We can come back to that. So we've got a small footprint but a big impact, and a good example of this would be in the north, the uranium mines. You've got the potential to contaminate with uranium whole river systems. You've got the potential to contaminate and Fly River that talk about Oktedi. The Oktedi River was essentially destroyed in a lot of ways, and that triggered a complete change that Ian mentioned around standards because of that catastrophe and other ones. So your question about offsets. So just to look at the Latrobe Valley, you know, a lot of investment going into the Latrobe River to rehabilitate it, for example. Well, why would you do that when you might just eliminate the entire river by mining? You might divert the whole thing. And so in the Latrobe River, certainly when I was at DSC, we explored the question of, instead of diverting the river and paying a huge amount, and Ross was involved in this stuff too, instead of paying a huge amount to try to create some sort of pseudo-natural river, instead the mining companies pay an offset amount, which you express in some sort of environmental credits, which could then be expanded somewhere else to maximise environmental benefit.
To get a better outcome.
To get a better outcome. And so you've got some notion of net environmental river benefit, and you get that small. So just to summarise, the problem with mining is because it only affects a small amount, you tend to think it's a small impact, but it could affect whole systems, and then because there's a lot of money in the mining sector, you can actually leverage a lot of money for a net environmental benefit somewhere else. But once you get into this offset thing, it's actually a devil's market, and it's quite a dangerous game, but probably one we'll get into.
Who decides?
Well, good people in government.
Good to hear. I mean, the problem with the mining versus cows, when you start to look at mines that are involved with metals, is that the damage is potentially permanent. You pull the cows out and you can restore the riverbanks, and that might be difficult and take a long time, but you can get the river probably back pretty much to what it was. But once you've got metals in there, I mean, we've got the mercury in the Luderderg from the 1800s, we've got the mercury in the Goulburn from the 1800s, they've got acid-forming, potentially acid-forming deposits all over the floodplain of the Fly River, thousands of square kilometres, and if that ever dries out, the whole thing's going to go acidic and all the vegetation will die. And that's there forever. There's nothing we can do about that. So that's, I think, one of the problems with metal mines. So it's a different issue when you're looking at coal mines and other forms of mining.
You still get acid mine drainage at the coal mines.
You can. You don't necessarily. But yeah, it's a... And that makes, it's very difficult. Who's going to be responsible for that in the long term? You're not supposed to eat fish from the Goulburn River upstream of Eildon or from the upper half of Eildon Reservoir. People don't know that, but it's on the Health Department website very clearly. You've all been told because of the mercury levels. And
there are even cautions about eating fish from Portfield Bay. I think it's a totally valid point you bring up there, Jeff, because ore deposits are where they are. We can't move them. That's where they are.
okay, if they're there and it's viable, it will get mined. So it is unfortunate. There's going to be an environmental impact, no doubt about it. There's going to be a hole in the ground. Those river systems are going to get cut. So to me, there is opportunity to manage that through our legislation and put in effective diversions and, you know, try and redevelop ecosystems or get offsets or whatever it might be. I think where it gets clouded and why the mining industry gets such a focus is because of the large profits that they generate. So just because they generate such large profits doesn't necessarily mean they're having such a large environmental impact. But they certainly are having a massive impact locally because it's a hole in the ground rather than, you know, native bush. So I think the cow debate is it's a lot less clear. I mean, it's probably massive impacts and one that can be managed differently. You know, perhaps with some money from the profits could go into getting a better environmental outcome rather than focusing on trying to squeeze the mining industry, which is 8.2% of GDP. You know, where it's a trade-off. Like, what are we going to give up? You know, our economy for, you know, to save, you know, to get a better environmental outcome. I think you need to look at where you best spend that money.
And from my perspective, Jeff, I'm not aware where offsets have been applied where, at this stage, where, if you like, you've traded off an ecological outcome there to gain sort of like an in-stream fish outcome there, a loss there for a vegetation outcome there. It means that, you know, that's starting to get in some very difficult computations and analysis. Throughout Australia, particularly Victoria, but there are the vegetation offsets that are happening, and there are the mechanisms for those vegetation offsets. So that can be done, and there are mechanisms in place to do that. But the other offsets, trading off water for vegetation or in-stream habitat for that, that's extremely complex and it's a difficult area to go into. The other one that I was just going to mention in terms of offset, I just started to just briefly touch on it, that's the profits that are derived from mining. There is something that we can all do, and that's have an influence on where the income that is generated for this country from mining gets placed. Now, we're going through a mining boom. It's been happening for a while, and we have a choice on what we do as a society with the income that's generated from that. Now, Kevin had a crack at it, getting some additional dollars in, but that's a fundamental question that we need to ask is what are we doing as a society with the income that we're generating from that, and what are we doing to put it back into either our future income producing potential as a nation or into environmental offsets or returns for the damage that's been done. And that's the question that we can all put pressure on our politicians.
I think it's important that it is a trade-off. I use the things that come from mines and I don't want to stop. And mining is inevitably destructive. So in any case, we're saying, look, is the benefit that we're going to get as a society, quite apart from the profits that the mine operators might make, going to outweigh the damage that's going to do, and that's going to vary a lot from place to place. In some places, mines will be way more damaging than in other places. I mean, Octedi was a horrendous place to build a mine because you've got very steep country, so you've got nowhere that you can store stuff that's flat. You've got 10 metres of rain a year, so whatever you store is going to get washed into rivers. And it's seismically active. You get earthquakes all the time. So if you try to build a tailings dam, you're going to have real problems. So that was probably a very poor place. But that mine was generating 40% of the foreign earnings of the PNG government. They couldn't afford to go without that money once they got the mine going. So, you know, it's going to be different trade-offs in different places.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, just to sort of wrap up on that, I think to me, I guess the goal is, it's the Titanic principle, really, isn't it? You've got people are drowning and they're hard to save. Rivers are pretty well stuffed from some mining, write them off, but put all your effort into those that are in good health in good boats. In the same way, that money, that effort should be transferred across. And I guess this whole there are super profits, and potentially because the environmental cost is not being taken into account. And yeah, again, I think sort of based on what Ross was saying as well, some of that money maybe should be going into some of these other campaigns to maintain rivers or rehabilitate or whatever it might be. But, so it doesn't necessarily need to be spending quite a few $1 million on a kilometre of stream, which has the ecological value of the Elwood Canal. You know, basically put the money elsewhere to me. Yeah. I don't really know what it is.
Darcy, a question on EIAs and geographic impact?
Yeah, so I'm by no means an expert in the EIA process, but I was just wondering whether perhaps there's more we could do to define our EIA process. So we're good at doing flora and fauna studies, we're good at doing cultural heritage studies. Perhaps we could do more to understand how the mine's going to impact the landscape and the river specifically.
Yeah, look, I know the site I'm on, for example, they've just done a big expansion, so they're opening up a whole new area, which is bush, and there's a massive.
Where's that?
So I'm up in the East Pilbara at a mine called the Anticugena, so it's iron ore country, and BHP is right next door. So
Up in the northwest.
yeah, up near the so probably the green dot up there, under the eye, up in that sort of area. And you know, there's a big diversion going on. It's quite big. You know, it's $1.5 billion worth of work just to get it set up. And there was an environmental impact statement prepared for that, and it was put out for public comment. So the process was gone through. So I don't think you know, there's any shortcuts or anything like that. It's a similar process, whether it's Victoria or WA, as far as I know. But who looks at it? Who's got the knowledge to make those decisions? And certainly the mining company, it's very much their, I mean, they do the studies. They're the ones providing information back to Perth. The last time one of the regulators came out to site I'm on was in 2006. Okay, so they're relying on us to send information back to them so they can make a decision. So if the mining company doesn't go out and do the studies, they're blind. But they are very good at doing it. And I don't see any other way other than getting more self-regulation into the mining industry. But I think it is there as far as the EIA process goes. Certainly in WA.
It depends on the regulator again. If you've got a competent authority that's reviewing the EIAs that are done and a clear process and a well-designed process, then companies will do good EIAs. The last thing a mining company wants is an EIA to be sent back and say, no, this is no good, we need you to do it again, and it's going to take you another year and it's going to hold up your project. So long as there are good requirements, then companies will do good EIAs. The problem arises if you're doing an EIA in Laos or Cambodia, where no one gives a stuff, and so long as it's thick, well, that's fine. And I've seen EIAs, one done on Thomas Hart Lake, which was 70% was maps of wind direction. It made a really thick document that was completely irrelevant to what the EIA was supposed to be about. So it really depends. If you've got a good system, then companies will follow those procedures and do it well. And if they know that that the documents produced are being properly reviewed, then they'll go to a lot of trouble to make certain that they've got good quality consultants to do it, because they don't want the stuff getting bounced back. But otherwise, if the hoops aren't there, then there's nothing to jump through, and it won't be done.
I agree. I think the answer lies in the regulatory process and the regulators and their skills, competence, and resources that they've got available to them. Absolutely.
I've got a bit of a different kind of question. I'm interested in the potential, the profitability potential of like the technosphere. So we're doing a lot of mining within these like raw country bush kind of areas where we're sourcing raw ore. But I'm wondering if there's any potential for efficiency gains through recycling of metals. So rather than going straight to the ore, going to our cities and recycling the metals that are already embedded within the system, rather than just going back to basics. Is there any potential and profitability changes that can occur based on that?
Bit of mercury in the Golden River up here.
Catch the fish to go out the mercury. Yeah. Does anyone have any expertise on that?
There's no way that you could substitute recycle for...
I'm not saying substitute, but I'm saying, can we start to be a bit better at using what we've got rather than just using once and then cradle to grave kind of attitude?
They're already pretty good at it, really. What I know is it's certainly Yeah, it's quite high in metal recycling in urban areas. You're getting up into the 60 to 70%, and it is really high, especially in the building sector. And the reason is it's worth so much money. So, but in terms of, so here's just a statistic. I mean, where does all this metal go? Where does all these minerals that are being mined go? It's all exporting.
Yeah.
And so here's an interesting statistic for you. I looked at this in terms of sediment yield. If you look at the entire sediment yield from the continent of Australia and what goes offshore into the sea from all of our rivers, and then you compare it with all the ships that are going offshore to Japan and China filled with iron ore and coal, which is bigger? And the result, the answer is 2 times as much rock or material comes off the continent in ships than off the entire continent by rivers.
So there's that helping with climate change.
Yeah, so that's not really. I mean, so the only point I'm making is that all of this coal and iron ore is actually going into Asia, and so it's a comparison with this recycling, which is indigenous, if you like.
Is Japan sinking under the weight?
China's expanding.
I've got a bit of a specific question about direct toxicity assessments for surface water discharge. I was wondering if any of you have had any experiences, whether that actually does work or whether it's just another mechanism for mining companies to kind of move the guidelines around as they, depending on what they come to mining. Do you have any experience with that?
I've had some experience with toxicity assessments. They're very limited in their value because the number of species that you can actually test is very small. I mean, if you test 4 or 5 species, that's considered a very extensive study, but if you're discharging into a stream, then you've got hundreds of species there. So it's useful as an initial screening to say, look, this effluent is very toxic or it's not very toxic, but it's not necessarily going to be a very accurate guide to how much impact you're going to have within the stream. And I've mainly seen it used with mines, with metals from mines, and there's real difficulties with that often because the chemical species is really important. So if you're trying to test a whole effluent and you take a sample and you take 2 days to get it back to the lab, the metal speciation has probably changed in that time anyway, so it becomes very difficult. So it's got some use, but it's also a fairly limited tool, I think.
Having been in the toxicity business, and particularly with zinc and cadmium, one of the problems is that in terms of regulators, they really are interested in 96-hour LC50s and things like that, which are giving you acute killing. You know, the animal dies in 4 days or something like that. When actually what the real problem is that maybe that this chemical there may be a very low strength, but it's going to knock out reproduction, or knock out muscle assimilation, or knock out calcium metabolism. And all those chronic effects never entered into the regulatory mechanism at all.
That's right, but you're showing your age, they don't do 96 hours now, it's too long.
Well, I think, USA,
yes.
Might just move on to the final sort of area. Sam, did you want to keep going with the heavy metal question?
Well, just simply, a lot of this has been talked about, but one of the things in my career I've come across areas where the heavy metal mining occurred and extreme events occurred. An example is the case where I worked in Canberra. The Molonglo River there, which flows into the national capital, was contaminated by a silver lead zinc mine in a place called Captain's Flat, which is 76 kilometres away from Canberra. And that occurred in an extreme event when all the tailings dumps spilt in the cloudburst. But the legacy is still there. And even though they spent in 1975, 76, $7 million to try and install the system, it hasn't worked. So what I'm sort of saying back to the mining industry, if these effects are going to be occur, and it's not just simply along the river, like it's like a whole lot. The Storage Creek South Esk system badly contaminated again by an extreme event occurring in the weather event, creating a flood. But even then, you don't have to have a flood, and you've got sort of Mount Morgan and other systems like that. And it seems that no one really actually, once the contamination occurs, people either live with it, or and the mining companies, in most cases, are not there to even fix it up. And the state is loath to come in and regulate it. say that, or to try and restore it. So it's a technological question. Can we restore these, or do we just have a society in which we walk away from these irreversible, possibly irreversible catastrophes?
The Mount Morgan example is a good one with the Dee River. That was a cyclone, was it 2000 last year?
Yeah.
Where you had acid sulfates, or from essentially a decommissioned mine, which was the Queensland government has taken responsibility for again, and then a cyclone comes and it spills acid sulfate, and the stream is beautiful blue, isn't it? Or aqua blue. So the copper, but that's not unusual. In that there was an article about this on the internet, and they mentioned that there are 50,000 mines like this that are abandoned mines, and they're all. And this is just this is the character, and it gets back to our cows. And this is the character of the mining industry, because they go in, they take the ore, and then they're gone. That's quite normal. But then we've got to somehow take responsibility. Somebody's got to take responsibility for the legacy of all of that. And to me, this is the fundamental question that we face. How do you take responsibility for the legacy? Now, just quickly on coal seam gas. This is going to be the same thing. So in case you don't know how this works, you pump the coal seam gas is that the coal generates methane, which sits around the gas, and it's held there under pressure by the water. And then you pump in more fluid, which is water with sand and some other chemicals, and that's like a gel. You crack or frack the coal, and then when you pull the water out, the sand keeps the fractures open, and then you de-water it to reduce the pressure, and the methane comes out. So that's fracking. Now the problem is you've got aquifers above, you've got aquifers below, you've got water. We don't even know, and this is the problem. You might not be able to see much effect now, but in generations to come you might. By which time the companies are gone and Marty's got a different job. So, this to me is a fundamental problem. How do you avoid socialising those losses, which always happens? And maybe people have got suggestions on how you do it. And the obvious way to do it is you make them pay up front, and you have a pool of money. Is the pool big enough? Well, that might be something that might have views on.
Look, what we do know, the mines have the bonds. There are bonds associated with rehabilitation, and the question that you're asking, that already exists. Are those bonds large enough to cover the scale of rehabilitation that's required?
Or you could have a mining tax which represents a mega bond, if you like, a super profits bond, where you socialise all that at national scale. That's another way to do it. You say, look, we know that there's going to be socialised costs here. Let's future fund.
How do you cost
well, that's right. But the way you cost it is you say there always is. We can be sure there will be. And so then you'd say, what's a reasonable proportion of expectation around that?
Yeah, but then how do you capture that doesn't become consolidated revenue for some other people?
Exactly. How complicated to do that?
But one of the things about this is that in the planning, surely we can learn from these examples that in the planning of these things, it was always, well not always, but invariably it's an extreme event. The mine work operated for quite a good time, and then suddenly bang, a cyclone comes in, or a cloudburst comes in, and that's never considered in the planning and construction of tailing dams or anything like that. And that's one of the problems. They don't build necessarily mining operations to deal rock and roll when an extreme event comes through. And the other question, of course, is in terms of restoration. It's a great technical challenge. How do you restore a river which has been hit with heavy rain? I mean, that's just out there.
I think, sorry, if I can just respond to Sam's comment there are two issues there. One is, what's a reasonable design event for the life of mine? Now, what do we as a society reasonably plan for? And the second one is, once you abandon the mine, you decommission it, the second item is, what legacy do you leave? Whether it's a void or a spoil pile or whatever, and what's the design event that we as a society adopt for that structure? And I guess what we start to need to think about, and some of the things that we're starting to think about, is do you start designing for PMF for these sorts of things that are left in perpetuity? Because if it's going to be there for the next 100 years, 200 years, and the impacts are so significant, then do you need to start then thinking about PMF as...
Probable maximum flood.
Sorry, probable maximum.
A good
example of that was the start of the range uranium mine, which was given permission to start on condition that all of the water in the mine was contained within the mine site. So all the rain on the mine site had to be contained. A storm event occurred before they actually finished doing the construction of a containing wall, which was significantly larger than the design event. And so the first thing they did was to go out and actually bulldoze down their own wall in order to allow the water to escape in a direction where it did least harm. And that was the end of the requirement to contain water on site. Because they simply used they used a design storm from a different location because there were no records at Ranger. And it was probably, I don't know what the period was, but even if it was the 100-year event, the error band around that up there is huge.
The first storm they got was 1 in 1,000, the second storm they got was 1 in 50. And it was jabber. They had no hope, they had no data at all. The Aboriginals had never kept data. They had no data. But look, can I ask this question? We talk about mining, coal, gold and all these. We pump water out of the ground, isn't that mining? So the Great Artesian Basin stuck completely. And I forget about cows because they have one sheep. But don't we mine water? And nobody's mentioning that.
Yes, we do.
Yes.
Well,
at an Olympic Dam, we're mining everything, including water.
no, but I mean Australia, we'll put a bore down anywhere. We're mining water.
Yeah.
So we're mining it, but when we look at mining as an Australian, we're assuming BHP and all the others like that. I mean, can we widen it a bit?
Well, you can widen it a lot because the notion of mining is it's a finite resource, and yet if you think about soils, you think about all sorts of natural systems, we mine them. Yeah, because we degrade them and their capacity over time.
But our groundwater's a finite
groundwater
resource too. We're not. I mean, if we waited around another 20 million years, we might get some of it.
Yeah. No, it's a really good point.
Following on from Ian's comment about Mount Morgan, the discussion we had there, I'm wondering if is there a national standard out there for rehabilitation of disused mines? And if so, is it adequate? And if not, should there be? This is a more technical question.
Well, you might be best to answer that, Ron. So I'm not aware of any standard. I'd love to see one.
No, but I know with reductions in coal prices, it's happened. I know it is a very hot topic through central Queensland. There's a lot of conferences, a lot of meetings to set up, to start planning around mine closure. So closure planning is the hot topic in Queensland at the moment because they're working out how do they close these sites.
So they've been approved without having to show a plan for closure?
Yeah, often it's a notional plan for closure, but the details around it just haven't been sorted out. I know in central Queensland also there are moves around to cease in future mines so that there's no final void left on the floodplain. So when I say final void, after you mine through it, whether you leave a hole at the end of your excavation. And I know in central Queensland they're moving towards not allowing final voids on any future approved mines. And that's a huge expense and a huge change for the mining companies, but that's planning that has to happen at the start of the mine because you need to build that into your complete mine plan. So there's a lot of thinking now that's going into, a lot more thinking going into closure planning, but there are no rules or regulations around it.
And that's a big step forward because a lot of these severe accidents with mines that have occurred post-mine closure have been tailings dumps and rock piles and so on that have been left behind, and simply developing a philosophy that we expect you to put that stuff back in the hole and backfill as you go means that you're significantly reducing the future risks. Always in the past, one of the big environmental benefits with mines was that the hole that's left behind, we're going to fill with water and it'll be a recreational resource for the whole community. And it'll be really pretty colour too because of the
you look across Australia, the sites that have probably had the most sophisticated rehabilitation are the bauxite mines in Western Australia, Alcoa. And there's a lot of literature, and the ecologists know more about this, but they actually seem to be pretty successful at vegetation rehabilitation, which is often the bit you see. The landscape you just leave, and the water quality legacy is difficult to manage. But the vegetation and, say, the nutrient status seems to be pretty successful.
Oh, yeah, it's successful. Yes, but also that's because the West Australian plants are pretty tough.
Yeah.
They are very, very tough.
There's definitely.
I mean, on the other hand, you're only taking out a layer.
Yes.
Of laterite, basically, and it's not. There's no sort of metal, bit of iron. That's about it.
The stuff you're taking out wasn't very good soil anyway.
Yeah.
There's definitely a requirement to put in a mine closure plan before you get your licence to operate, but that can be a 5-10 year plan. So things change a lot, and often it's done just to demonstrate you're thinking about it. But to give you an example in iron ore in WA that I've come across, the majority of mines, about 70% of the ore is underground. Below water table. So it has to be dewatered to access that ore. Now the current standard is that the mines need to be backfilled above the groundwater table. Okay. Now if you're extracting, or digging 80 metre, 100 metre, sometimes 250 metre deep hole, and exporting 70% of that over to China, it just doesn't add up. He could possibly fill that hole back up to above the water table level, right? But that's what the plan say they're going to do. So, a lot of these closure plans talk about going to clear the adjacent hills to fill the hole to comply with the licence requirement. And I kid you not, that is in the plans. Okay? So this whole discussion about mine closure and how much money is allocated to it, it's still very raw, and from what I've seen, there's nowhere near enough money to do it effectively.
So we're actually importing Japan's mountains soon in order to fill our holes. All the boats come back out.
Yeah, there's going to be heaps of sea lakes, basically.
Mike, just one time for one more question.
I was going to say, there's been actually a lot of work done in Victoria and landfills, which are on a lot smaller scale with this kind of stuff. Where once upon a time, closure plans weren't thought about at all. But now as part of the EIA process, you need to put all that kind of thing in, and it all needs to be costed. And it actually has in the last 10 years, probably changed a lot and come a long way forward. And let's hope that kind of thing is adopted in the mining industry.
Well, I think that's a good point, because in fact, if you look back at the gold mining days, we have come a long way. I mean, it's not as though this is a disaster. The standards are pretty high. Marty says it's a lot better. We've learned some of the lessons from Optega, I think, internationally. Standards internationally, you actually use Australian standards now when you go into Southeast Asia and South America largely. And I think we're making progress. It's not all a tragic story.
I think if we now start to bring things a little closer to home for us here in Victoria, I think one of the things that will be, should be on our mind is the closure plans for the Latrobe Valley. We have some huge holes in the Latrobe Valley. And,
it's going to become a lake, isn't it?
Well, either accidentally or intentionally.
We're running out of landfill.
So you don't need to worry about that trade, because the whole valley will just be a lake.
So in terms of closure plan, and I guess one of the issues in there was, with the potential closure of mines associated with the carbon schemes that are on at the moment. I guess one of the fears that I always had was, say your lawn was to close, whether the bonds were sufficient to deal with things like the Morwell River that currently runs as an aqueduct through the middle of the mine. I think there are some major issues in the Latrobe that need to be sorted out before those places can be closed.
Have you given any thought to rehabilitating it as a lake? I mean, if you let the water just sit around in there, you're going to get sort of hardly a sitting.
They've already had one trial, I think.
It's going to be a major challenge for Victoria.
Bring in tons of calcium or something.
Well, interestingly, with that when they pumped the water out, I was asking the EPA about this the other day. Surely the water that went into the mine from the failure would have been really acidic and full of. No, they pumped it out and it met all the EPA standards. So either the standards are really low.
Everybody out there.
Yeah.
Just to wrap up, I mean, do the panelists want to say any final thoughts? Just having got across.
I'm done.
I just think that we have a framework and we just need to get better at our authorities need to become educated and therefore put better guidelines in place, because the Titanic theory, focusing on the bigger miners, they will implement that. There's no doubt they've got the funds to do it, and if they get the right guidance from our consultants and our regulators, it will be a much better outcome. So it's not like,
It means the regulators should be given the resources to
Yeah, absolutely. My concluding comment is around land use planning, and in terms of our planning for new mining developments, whether it's CSG or opening up areas for mining, we put a lot of effort into planning our urban centres and our road networks and our sewage networks and all the things that go with a new urban centre. I get a sense that we just as a society don't put that thinking up front with our mining developments and how a series of mines will come together and the cumulative impacts of those and how they will work together and the outcomes that will accrue from that. And I think there's a lot more work needed by, if you like, government regulators in that land use planning stage before areas are opened up for mining.
And I think in terms of cumulative impact, we've tended to focus on large mining companies, but of course there are lots and lots of people whose hobby is fossicking for gold, and we at the moment have a big push on to allow fossicking for gold in streams in national parks in Victoria, which was a promise of the government when it was elected, and which they're now looking at implementing over the next 6 to 12 months. So, and that's going to be very, very difficult to regulate, and potentially, depending on where they're fossicking and how they're fossicking, could be quite significant. Has significant impacts on streams.
Any final?
Oh, just to emphasise again, I think that the lessons from history are real. And the reality is we just do not get this right. We always socialise the costs, we privatise the gains, and we're doing this at massive scale. And I think that if you just start with that point, that somehow you have to imagine there's going to be future costs for this, and is the bond big enough?
socialise the gains.
Yes, socialise the gains somehow. That's a really weird idea.
All right, well, please thank our panellists, Ian Campbell, Ross Hardy, Matty Hillmaker, and
Socialise the gains from tonight. Thank you very much. Ian, Ross, thank you very much. Cheers, Matty.
thanks.
Ian, thank you very much. Yeah, and of course, can you all join me and thank Chris for emceeing tonight. I'd like to thank everyone else for coming. It's been great, really useful debate, really valuable. I've certainly learned a lot tonight about mining and waterways. I guess basically, please keep an eye and ear out for our next seminar. In another 2 months' time. We have 6 of these per year. Is that right? Yes, 6 per year. We have reading groups for those that don't know every month on particular topics to do with natural resource management. We've got an industry night coming up at the end of August, so all those fine diversions that you've done can be part of that industry night. So there'll be notification coming out in the next month or so about that. So any projects to do with the natural resources field, then basically start thinking about submitting them before the end of the financial year. So again, details to come. Thanks a lot.